Elaine never imagined that taking care of three little girls would change her life forever, but when a dangerous secret surfaces, everything she thought she knew is turned upside down. What will she do when the people she loves most are put in jeopardy? Stay with us to uncover the heart-wrenching choices Elaine must make, and don't forget to let us know where you're watching from. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Ella Thompson was accustomed to the silence of the enormous Harrison mansion. The girls had not yet returned from school, and the parents often spent long hours away from home, leaving the vast property devoid of life. At 45 years old, Elaine had found a routine in this job, but not an empty one. It was filled with purpose. Her days revolved around the three little girls who, from the very first moment, filled her life with laughter, endless questions, and a genuine love that she had rarely felt before. The Harrisons lived in a quiet suburb of California. The mansion was luxurious, with immaculate rooms, walls adorned with expensive art, and gardens so perfect they looked like something out of a magazine. However, within those walls, the true heart of the house was not the furniture or decorations, but the triplets Ashley, Brenda, and Caroline, three 6-year-old girls as identical in appearance as they were different in personality. Elaine had become more than just their nanny, their confidant, their comfort, and the refuge of tenderness they so desperately needed. Each morning, after ensuring that the girls were ready for school, Elaine spent a couple of hours organizing the house, washing the breakfast dishes, or folding laundry. She always made sure everything was perfect for when the parents returned, but as the day wore on, her mind would refocus on what truly mattered: the triplets. Over time, the girls had begun to call her "my love," a nickname that brought a smile to her face every time she heard it. There was nothing Elaine cherished more than those moments of closeness with them. That day didn't seem different from any other. The girls came home from school a bit tired, as usual. Elaine greeted them with her usual warmth, helping them change clothes and preparing their snack in the kitchen. Ashley, the quietest of the three, sat in silence, watching Elaine place the cookies on a plate. Brenda and Caroline, always more lively, chatted incessantly, discussing a game they wanted to play after their snack. "My love, can we play house after we eat?" Caroline asked with bright eyes. Elaine smiled, "Of course, but only if you finish all your food." The girls nodded quickly, and for a few minutes, there were laughs and cookie crumbs scattered across the table. Hook, will a broken promise reveal a hidden threat? But soon, Brenda began to cry. Elaine, with a patience she had developed over the years, knelt in front of her. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked softly, stroking the little girl's hair. Brenda didn't respond immediately. Her tear-filled eyes seemed to search for something beyond the kitchen. "Dad said he would come see me today," she finally murmured between sobs. Elaine felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew the girls' parents were busy people, but Mr. Harrison had promised more than once to spend more time with his daughters, and he rarely followed through. For Elaine, it was painful to see the little ones get disappointed, but she knew her job was not to judge, her job was to be there for them. "I'm sure your dad will be here soon, Brenda, and in the meantime, how about we play for a while?" she suggested, trying to redirect the girls' attention to something more positive. Brenda nodded, although her eyes were still clouded with sadness. Elaine led them to the playroom, a spacious area filled with toys that looked almost new. She watched the girls interact, noting how Ashley preferred to stay in her own world while Brenda and Caroline competed to be the center of attention. Minutes passed, and just when Elaine began to relax, she heard the sound of the front door opening. It was early for Mr. Harrison to be home. Quickly, she got up and walked toward the foyer, encountering the serious face of John Harrison. "Is everything okay, Elaine?" he asked, his voice colder than usual. Elaine nodded, a bit nervous. It was uncommon for him to arrive home at this hour, and his tone did not bode well. "Yes, the girls are playing in the living room," she replied, trying to keep calm. John said nothing more and walked toward the living room. Elaine followed at a respectful distance, watching as the girls excitedly ran towards him upon seeing him. "Dad!" shouted Brenda, hugging his legs. John smiled, but it was a distant, almost empty smile. Elaine noted the immediate change in atmosphere. The girls didn't seem to perceive it, but she did. There was something different about him. For a few minutes, John simply watched his daughters play, but soon his attention shifted to Elaine, who remained nearby, observing in silence. Elaine, can we talk for a moment? He suddenly said, his tone more serious than before. Elaine felt a chill run down her spine. She nodded and followed him into the kitchen, where John closed the door behind him. I want to talk to you about, he began, but his words faded into the air. The silence between them was heavy, uncomfortable. Elaine knew something was wrong, but she didn't dare to ask. You've been here a long time, John finally said, avoiding her gaze. Elaine nodded again, unsure of where this conversation was headed. The girls adore you, that's clear, he continued, though his voice sounded increasingly distant, but I think it's time to make some changes. Elaine felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. She didn't need to hear more to understand what was coming. She had been part of those girls' lives for so long that she couldn't imagine a day without them, but at that moment, everything she had built, all the love and dedication, seemed to collapse in seconds. What do you mean? She asked in a faint voice, trying to stay strong. John finally looked at her, and in his eyes, there was no trace of the coldness he had shown earlier, but neither was there the closeness they once shared as employer and employee. Things are going to change, Elaine, he replied, and although his words were vague, the weight of their meaning was crushing. Elaine lowered her gaze, feeling that the bond she had formed with the girls was about to break, with nothing she could do to stop it. However, what happened next would change their lives forever. Night had fallen over the Harrison mansion, and as always, Elaine was in her usual routine. The triplets, with their seemingly endless energy, had played until they were exhausted. Elaine took them to their room, making sure each one was comfortably tucked in. Ashley and Caroline were already fast asleep, but Brenda was still awake, watching Elaine with sleepy eyes. My love, can you stay a little longer? Brenda asked, her tiny voice barely a whisper. Elaine smiled wearily, stroking the girl's forehead. Of course, sweetheart, but you need to try to sleep, okay? Tomorrow will be a long day. Brenda nodded, though her eyes still seemed full of questions, as if she knew something was wrong. Elaine turned off the room light, leaving only a small lamp on in the corner, and stepped out of the room, closing the door slowly. The silence in the house was almost absolute at this hour. The Harrisons usually stayed in their bedroom, or at least that was what Elaine assumed. But as she walked down the hallway, something broke that silence. A strange noise, almost imperceptible, came from the back of the house. Elaine stopped in her tracks, listening intently. The sound was subtle, like a slight creak of wood or a whisper, something that could easily be attributed to the age of the mansion. However, something in her gut told her it wasn't normal. She tried to dismiss her own thoughts. It's just the house, old and full of noises, she told herself, but she couldn't ignore the growing unease in her chest. The Harrisons had always insisted that the security of the house was impeccable, that nothing could happen in such an exclusive neighborhood. Still, Elaine felt that something was out of place. She walked into the kitchen to finish organizing a few things, but the noise returned. This time it was louder, clearer. It seemed to be coming from the back of the hallway, near the Harrisons' bedroom. Elaine abandoned what she was doing and, without thinking too much, began to walk toward the sound. Her breathing quickened with each step she took. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, the automatic lights had yet to activate. Elaine stopped halfway, contemplating whether she should return to the girls' room to ensure they were safe instead of continuing this absurd exploration, but something inside her pushed her to keep going. When she reached the door to the master bedroom, she found it ajar, which was unusual. It was always closed when the Harrisons were inside. Elaine froze for a moment, her trembling hand hovering over the doorknob before gently pushing the door open. The room was empty, the bed was made, and everything seemed in its place, but something felt off. Elaine stepped inside when another sound caught her attention. It came from the wardrobe at the end of the room. This time, the noise was unmistakable. Someone was inside. Elaine held her breath and, with shaking hands, walked toward the wardrobe. Her heart raced as fear coursed through her body with each step. The pressure in her chest intensified. Finally, she grasped the wardrobe handle and turned it. What she saw made her stomach churn. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison were inside, bound and gagged, their eyes filled with terror. Mrs. Harrison, her face pale and streaked with tears, was trying to say something, but the gag prevented any sound from escaping. Mr. Harrison was also immobilized, his expression oscillating between desperation and anger. Elaine recoiled, feeling panic take over her body. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. She wanted to scream, But she couldn't allow herself to do that. The girls were just a few meters away, sleeping in their room. She couldn't risk waking them or alerting the intruder, whoever it was. Without wasting another moment, she hurried to free Mr. Harrison, her trembling fingers struggling with the knots that bound him. As she worked, urgency and fear consumed her every second. "Who was it, Elaine?" she whispered urgently as she untied the ropes. John Harrison, once freed, removed his gag and whispered in a hoarse voice, "Grayson, the gardener. He's here, Elaine, you have to get the girls out of here quickly." Elaine felt a chill run down her spine. Grayson, the young gardener who had worked for the family for years, was an almost invisible figure in the house, always working quietly, always keeping his distance. Elaine had never suspected anything about him, and now this revelation left her paralyzed. "Where is he now?" Elaine asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know, but he's in the house," John replied, his face serious. Elaine glanced at Mrs. Harrison, who was still trembling, unable to move. Then, without saying more, she rushed out of the room. Her priority was the girls. She couldn't let anything happen to them. The hallway seemed endless as Elaine ran toward the Triplets' room, her mind clouded with fear and adrenaline, but a single thought guided her: protect them at all costs. When she arrived, she burst through the door and found all three girls still asleep, unaware of the danger lurking nearby. Without wasting a second, she gently woke them, trying not to frighten them. "Girls, we have to leave right now," she whispered, attempting to maintain her composure. Brenda, the most perceptive, was the first to notice Elaine's worried expression. "What's wrong, my love?" she asked. "There's no time for questions, sweetheart," Elaine replied, lifting Caroline into her arms. "We need to go, trust me, okay?" Ashley and Brenda sat up, still groggy, but nodded their heads. Elaine, with Caroline in her arms, quickly guided them toward the back door of the house, staying in the darkness, feeling the danger drawing closer with every step. The night air was cold as they finally stepped into the garden. Elaine could hear her own heart pounding as she hurried to take the girls to the back, where they could hide in a small playhouse they used to play in. The cold night air weighed heavily on Elaine as she crouched down, shielding the girls in the small playhouse. She could feel the weight of Caroline in her arms, and the girl's small, frantic breaths echoed in her ears. Grayson was close, too close, and his presence enveloped everything with a silent threat that made it hard to think clearly. Elaine knew they couldn't stay there for long. Grayson wouldn't take long to find their hiding spot. Her mind raced, searching for a solution, any way to get them away from danger. The fear was overwhelming, but the instinct to protect the girls kept her standing, alert, ready to do whatever it took. "What are we going to do, my love?" Ashley whispered, her big eyes filled with fear. Elaine crouched down to the girls' level, keeping her voice low and calm, even though she felt on the verge of collapse inside. "I'm going to find a way to get us out of here, but I need you to trust me and not make any noise, okay?" The three girls nodded silently, their trust in Elaine absolute. They had no one else. Elaine knew that to escape, she had to distract Grayson, to draw him away far enough to get the girls out of the house. She looked back at the mansion. The only option that came to mind was to climb to the roof, a risky move, but perhaps the only way to save them. There was no time to waste. She left the girls hidden in the playhouse, making sure they wouldn't come out, and went back inside the house in search of an opportunity to call the police. She tiptoed through the dark hallway, her hands sweaty and trembling. When she reached the kitchen, she grabbed the landline phone, but just as she was about to dial, the dead tone confirmed her worst fears. Grayson had cut the phone lines. Elaine pressed her lips together, frustrated but not surprised. There was no time to lament. She quickly turned towards the stairs, knowing Grayson could appear at any moment. She had to act fast. If she could make it to the second floor and out one of the attic windows, maybe she could get the girls to the roof and find a way to escape. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. Grayson was close, closer than she had imagined. Elaine held her breath and hid behind the kitchen door. Through a crack, she could see him enter, searching, moving with a terrifying calm. The darkness barely concealed his face, but the coldness in his expression was unmistakable. "Elaine," he called, his hoarse voice filling the room, "you can't hide forever. You know this is just business, right? It's nothing personal." Elaine felt a wave of anger mixed with fear for Grayson. This was just a means to get money, a revenge for something she still didn't fully understand, but for her and the girls, this was much more. It was life or death. She waited patiently, not moving, until Grayson finally left the kitchen, seemingly searching for another place to find her. When she was sure the immediate danger had passed, Elaine emerged from her hiding spot and ran upstairs, taking 2 steps at a time, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. She reached the attic, closed the door behind her, and hurried to open the window that led to the roof. The cold night wind hit her immediately, but she didn't care. She had made it this far, and now she just had to go back for the girls. Just as she was about to climb down, she heard the sound of the attic door slowly opening. She turned and saw Grayson in the doorway, staring at her, his face now fully visible in the moonlight filtering through the window. "You have nowhere to go, Elaine," he said with a twisted smile. "Do you really think you're going to escape?" Elaine didn't respond. It made no sense to reason with him. Instead, she leapt out the window onto the roof, her body almost trembling with adrenaline. She slid down the shingles, struggling to maintain her balance. From there, she could see the playhouse where she had left the girls. "Girls," she called urgently but quietly, "come up quickly." The 3 triplets emerged from the playhouse and ran toward her as fast as their little legs would allow. Elaine helped them up onto the roof first, lifting Caroline and then the other 2. Her whole body trembled, but she couldn't afford to stop. She had to keep going. From the roof, Elaine spotted something that made her heart leap. In the distance, police car lights were flashing. How did they find out? Maybe one of the neighbors had heard something, or perhaps the Harrisons themselves had managed to alert someone before Grayson attacked them. It didn't matter how, but she knew help was on the way. Grayson, seeing the lights, began to lose control. He climbed onto the roof after them, his face twisted with rage, anger, and desperation. "You're not going to escape, Elaine. This isn't over," he shouted as he got closer, moving faster. With the girls by her side, Elaine slowly backed away, trying to stay calm. "The girls have nothing to do with this," she said firmly. "If you want something, let them go. This is between you and the Harrisons." Grayson let out a bitter laugh. "It's too late for that. Nobody's getting out unscathed." Just then, the blue and red lights of the police illuminated the yard. Elaine could see officers getting out of their vehicles and surrounding the house. Relief flooded her, but she knew she wasn't out of danger yet. "Up here," she shouted, waving her arms to get the officers' attention. The police began to move quickly, surrounding the house. In a matter of seconds, Grayson, seeing his plan unraveling, made one last desperate attempt to reach Elaine, but she dodged him with agility. In a clumsy and furious move, Grayson lost his balance and fell off the roof, landing in the garden with a sickening thud. Elaine stood frozen for a moment, breathing heavily. The girls clung to her, trembling with fear, but finally safe. Officers quickly climbed onto the roof to help them down, and Grayson, injured but conscious, was handcuffed by the police. When they finally made it to the ground, Elaine collapsed onto the grass, her body shaking from exhaustion. The girls cuddled up beside her, holding her tightly. "Everything is okay now, sweetheart," she murmured, stroking Caroline's hair, but inside, Elaine knew nothing would ever be the same. The police car lights continued to illuminate the Harrisons' yard as Elaine sat on the grass with the girls curled up next to her, trying to regain her composure. The chaos she had experienced over the past few hours seemed to have finally dissipated. The officers were leading Grayson away in handcuffs, his face hardened by anger and defeat. Elaine was breathing heavily, but she knew the immediate danger had passed. She was safe, and most importantly, the girls were safe too. However, something in the air felt strange. Elaine noticed that 2 officers approached her, their cold, professional gazes contrasting with the relief she had begun to feel. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, leaned toward her. "Miss Thompson, we need to ask you a few questions," he said, his voice firm but lacking any hint of empathy. Elaine nodded, still feeling her hands tremble. She hadn't done anything wrong, but something in the officer's tone made her feel uncomfortable. "What is your relationship with Grayson Beckett?" the officer asked, his eyes fixed on her. Elaine blinked, surprised by the question. "Grayson? He was the gardener for the Harrisons. I don't have any relationship with him beyond that," she replied honestly, though something in the way he asked made her understand that it wasn't enough. "Are you sure?" the officer pressed. "We know you both worked in the same house for years, and according to records, you shared the same circle of acquaintances some time ago. Doesn't that seem like more than a mere coincidence?" Elaine froze. She knew that before working for the Harrisons, she had had a brief encounter with Grayson in a different work context, but they had never crossed paths beyond the strictly professional. However, the way the officer framed it made her feel like she had more to explain. Yes, we worked together before, at a house where he did temporary jobs, but we never had a personal relationship. He was just another staff member. I didn't know anything about his life outside of work, she clarified, trying to stay calm, but the officer didn't seem convinced. That's something we'll have to investigate further, he said, and before Elaine could respond, they signaled for her to stand up. What are you doing? She asked, her voice breaking as she watched the second officer pull out handcuffs. Her heart began to race again, this time not from fear of danger, but from confusion and desperation. It's just a standard procedure, the officer replied, avoiding her gaze. Until we clarify all the details of what happened here tonight, you must come with us. No! Brenda shouted from the back, her small voice echoing in the garden. The three girls, who had been by her side until that moment, quickly got up, running towards her. Don't take her away. Elaine tried to stand firm, but tears began filling her eyes. I haven't done anything, she whispered, unable to hide the anguish in her voice, but it was too late. The cuffs made a metallic clink as they closed around her wrists. The girls were screaming and crying, clinging to her clothes, pleading for them not to take her away. But my love, don't go. Caroline said, trying to cling to Elaine's legs. The pain in her voice was unbearable. The Harrisons, who had been watching the scene from the entrance of the house, quickly approached. Sarah Harrison, her eyes still swollen from the anguish of the past hours, tried to intervene. Officer, please, Sarah said, her voice weary and trembling. Elaine has nothing to do with this. She has been part of our family for years. I don't understand why you are treating her this way. But the officer remained unmoved. We'll decide that once the investigation is concluded. For now, she must accompany us. John Harrison also tried to reason with them, but his words fell on deaf ears. The police had already made a decision, and within minutes, Elaine was led to the patrol car while the girls continued to scream and cry, unable to understand what was happening. Inside the car, Elaine looked out the window, her eyes fixed on the girls who were collapsing in pain in the garden. Brenda, Ashley, and Caroline, all crying desperately. It was a heart-wrenching sight. Elaine closed her eyes, letting the tears run down her cheeks. Everything she had worked for, all the love she had given to those girls, now seemed to be collapsing into a storm of misunderstandings and false accusations. The days in prison were endless. Elaine couldn't stop thinking about the girls. Sarah Harrison visited her the next day, her expression full of sorrow. We're doing everything we can to get you out of here, Elaine, Sarah said, sitting across from her behind the glass in the visiting room. We hired a lawyer, and he's already working on your case. We know you're innocent. I'm so sorry about all this. Elaine nodded, but the pain didn't fade. All she could think about was the girls. Sarah told her that since the day she was arrested, the triplets hadn't stopped asking about her. Brenda had fallen ill with a high fever, and the other two were apathetic and sad. They didn't want to eat, they didn't want to play, all they wanted was to see Elaine. They shouldn't have to go through this, Elaine whispered, struggling to hold back tears. This isn't fair for them. I know, Sarah replied, but we're going to fix this, trust me. The following weeks were torment for Elaine. The cold and loneliness of prison became more unbearable with each letter she received from Sarah, describing how the girls were getting sicker and worse over time without her. The Harrison house seemed to have lost its light. Finally, after what felt like months of anguish, the Harrisons' lawyer managed to gather enough evidence to prove her innocence. The investigation revealed that Grayson had planned to kidnap the girls, intending to demand a ransom that would alleviate his enormous debts. Elaine had no connection to his crimes. She was merely another victim of his misguided revenge. The day Elaine was released, Sarah and John Harrison were waiting for her at the prison entrance. Sarah hugged her tightly, and John, though less emotional, gave her a pat on the shoulder. Thank you for everything, Sarah said, tears in her eyes. We couldn't have gotten through this without you. But the true relief came when Elaine stepped back into the mansion and was greeted by the triplets. The girls ran toward her, hugging her with a strength that almost knocked her over. My love, don't ever leave again. Brenda cried out through sobs as her sisters surrounded her, crying tears of joy. Elaine, with tears in her eyes, embraced the three girls, feeling the weight of the past days fade away. She knew that the road to emotional recovery would be long, both for herself and for the girls, but in that moment, surrounded by their unconditional love, she knew they had something they could never lose, the bond that united them beyond any doubt or accusation. Years passed quickly, and the Harrison triplets, no longer so small, found themselves at a pivotal moment in their lives. Ashley, Brenda, and Caroline were in college, each forging her own path. Despite the distances and new experiences, they had never forgotten Elaine, the woman who had been much more than a nanny to them. Her bravery and unconditional love during those childhood years had left an indelible mark on their hearts. During a college break, they decided to visit her. They had kept in touch over the years, but visits became increasingly infrequent as their lives filled with new responsibilities. Still, the desire to reconnect with her was as strong as ever. Elaine had stopped working for the Harrison family shortly after the girls had grown up, and since then, she had remained somewhat distant, as if something in her had changed forever after that fateful incident with Grayson. That day, the sun shone brightly as the triplets climbed into the car and headed toward the modest neighborhood where Elaine lived. Brenda, who had always been the most sensitive of the three, couldn't help but feel a twinge of concern as they drove through the narrow, shabby streets. "Do you think she'll be okay?" she asked, looking out the window with a furrowed brow. "Of course she will," Caroline, the most optimistic of the trio, replied. "Elaine has always been strong." She paused, hesitating for a moment. "We haven't seen her in a long time." Ashley, who was driving, said nothing, but a sense of unease began to grow in her chest. Elaine had always been a solid figure in their lives, someone they could trust unconditionally. The idea that she might be going through a tough time hadn't truly crossed their minds until now. Upon arriving at the address they remembered, the triplets exchanged glances filled with surprise and worry. Elaine's house, a small, single-story home, was almost unrecognizable. The front yard, once well-kept and filled with flowers, was now overrun with weeds, the windows were dirty, and the paint on the facade was peeling. There were no signs of the vitality that once characterized Elaine's home. "This isn't right," Brenda murmured as she stepped out of the car, followed by her sisters, with their hearts in their throats. The three made their way to the door and knocked softly. At first, there was no response, but after a few seconds, they heard the slow shuffling sound of footsteps on the other side. When the door opened, what they saw left them speechless. Elaine, the energetic and loving woman who had been the pillar of their lives, stood before them, but she was barely a shadow of her former self. Her hair, which she had always kept neat, was now disheveled and gray. Her eyes, once bright with warmth, were dull, filled with a deep sadness. The clothes she wore were wrinkled, and her skin seemed to have aged beyond her actual years. "Girls?" Elaine asked, her voice hoarse and weak, as if she struggled to recognize them. "Elaine," Ashley whispered, stepping toward her but unable to hide the shock on her face. Elaine looked at them with a mixture of surprise and confusion, as if she hadn't expected to see them, as if she hadn't been prepared for a reunion. She slowly stepped aside, inviting them in, though the interior of the house was as desolate as its exterior. The triplets entered the small living room and stood still, taking in the incredulity of what they saw. The house was in ruins, ripped furniture, dust piled on every surface, and several valuable possessions, the few they knew Elaine cherished, had vanished. The atmosphere was suffocating, a reflection of the life that seemed to have crumbled around Elaine. "What happened here?" Caroline asked, her voice breaking as she looked around. Elaine shrugged, as if the state of her home didn't matter, or as if she didn't know how to stop its deterioration. "It's nothing, just things have been a bit tough lately," she murmured, avoiding eye contact. Brenda, with tears in her eyes, approached and took Elaine's hands. They were cold and trembling, further proof of the physical and emotional where she had suffered. "Why didn't you tell us anything?" Brenda asked, unable to hide her sadness. "We would have made sure to help you." Elaine smiled weakly, but it wasn't a comforting smile, it was a smile filled with resignation. "I didn't want to worry you, you were always so busy with your studies, with your lives. I thought it wasn't important." Her voice faded at the end, as if even speaking took energy. The triplets exchanged looks filled with pain. They had never imagined that Elaine, the person who had given them so much love and protection, could be living in such deplorable conditions, so alone. "You've always been important to us," Ashley said, moving to sit next to her on the dilapidated sofa. "No matter what happens, we will never forget everything you did for us." Elaine looked down, visibly moved, but still trapped in a sadness that seemed too deep to dissipate easily. "I'm not the same as before," she finally admitted. After what happened with Grayson, after everything, I just couldn't move forward in the same way. The triplets fell silent for a moment. They knew that the incident with Grayson had been a turning point for everyone, but they never imagined how deeply it had affected Elaine. The prison, the unjust accusation, and the trauma of it all had changed her profoundly, leaving scars they hadn't seen until now. "But we're here now," Caroline said, taking Elaine's hand, "and we're going to help you. You don't have to go through this alone." Elaine looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, a spark of hope seemed to flicker in her eyes. "I didn't want to be a burden," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You'll never be a burden," Brenda replied, hugging her tightly. "You gave us so much, now it's our turn to return that love." Silence filled the room, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence, it was a silence charged with understanding, with promises unspoken but felt. The triplets knew that helping Elaine emerge from this darkness would be a long process, but they were determined to be there for her, just as she had been for them in their childhood. Elaine, with tears in her eyes, allowed herself, for the first time in years, to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. After that painful visit to Elaine's house, Ashley, Brenda, and Caroline couldn't stop thinking about the situation their beloved nanny was in. The image of the disoriented and sad woman living in deplorable conditions wouldn't leave their minds. Something didn't fit. They knew Elaine wasn't someone who would simply let her life fall apart without a fight, and they decided they needed to find out what had happened. As they talked among themselves, they began to recall some details Elaine had mentioned during their conversation, things that at the time seemed insignificant but now took on new meaning. She briefly mentioned a cousin who had come to help her, someone the triplets had never met. The way she spoke about him was vague, and now that they thought about it, there was something in her tone that didn't seem quite right. "Do I think that man has something to do with all of this?" Ashley said as the three of them sat at the kitchen table in their parents' house, staring at the few belongings Elaine had managed to keep. "It has to be," Caroline replied. Elaine wouldn't have fallen into this situation if there wasn't some kind of manipulation involved. Brenda, the most reserved of the three at that moment, looked at the few jewelry pieces and items Elaine had treasured for so many years, gifts from her parents, from the Harrisons, who had played an important part in her life. She knew how much sentimental value they held for her, and the idea that someone had stolen them was unbearable. "We have to do something," Brenda finally said with a determination that surprised her sisters. "If that man is stealing from her, we're going to find out." With that goal in mind, the triplets decided to investigate further. They used their father's contacts in the city to gather information about Elaine's supposed cousin. It wasn't hard to discover that the man, named Roger, had suddenly appeared in Elaine's life just over a year ago, right when her situation began to deteriorate. He had been introduced as a distant relative who was supposedly there to help her with daily tasks and managing her pension, but something didn't add up. As they dug deeper into the records, they found disturbing details. Roger had a history of small scams, primarily targeting elderly or vulnerable individuals. He moved from city to city, taking advantage of those who trusted him, and worst of all, they discovered that in recent months, he had been cashing Elaine's pension checks, selling some of her possessions, and making valuable items she had kept for years disappear, including the jewelry and artifacts the Harrisons had gifted her after her release. The discovery enraged the triplets. They felt a mix of indignation and sadness as they realized that Elaine, the person who had always been a strong figure in their lives, had been betrayed by her own relative. They knew they couldn't let this continue. "We need to talk to her," Ashley said firmly. "Elaine needs to know the truth." The next day, the triplets returned to Elaine's house. This time, they found her in the same state, but now their faces reflected not just worry, but a firm resolve. Elaine, upon seeing them, tried to smile, though sadness still lingered on her face. "How are you, girls?" she asked, attempting to sound cheerful, though her voice revealed fatigue. "We need to talk, Elaine," Caroline said, taking a seat across from her while her sister did the same. Elaine looked at them, somewhat surprised by Caroline's serious tone, but nodded, preparing for what was to come. "We know what's going on," Brenda said directly. "We know your cousin Roger is not here to help you. We found out he's been stealing from you, selling your things, and keeping your pension." Elaine blinked, clearly confused at first, then her face twisted in a mix of disbelief and pain. "Roger," she murmured. "He wouldn't do that. He's here to help me. He's always told me that things are tough. That's why he had to sell some things to make sure I have enough money." Brenda shook her head. We investigated, Elaine, he has a record. This isn't the first time he's done this, he's been taking advantage of you since he got here. Elaine's expression shifted from confusion to anguish. Brenda's words began to sink in, and the little details she had ignored for months started to come together: the small sales Roger had made to help her, the money that seemed to disappear inexplicably, and the valuable items that had vanished without explanation. Now it all made sense, and Elaine couldn't believe how blind she had been. No, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I trusted him. We know, Ashley said gently, reaching out to take Elaine's hand, but you're not alone in this anymore, we're going to stop him. Elaine sobbed, unable to contain the torrent of emotions that overwhelmed her. She had felt so alone, so desperate, that she had believed in the only person who seemed willing to help her, not realizing he was the reason for her misfortune. I don't know what to do, she said, her voice breaking from the pain. I can't believe someone from my own blood would do this to me. We will do it, Caroline said, her tone more determined than ever. The tension in the room was palpable as Ashley, Brenda, and Caroline stood in the dilapidated living room of Elaine's house. Before them stood Roger, the cousin who had arrived at the house just moments ago. His defensive attitude and refusal to take responsibility only fueled the triplets' anger and frustration. They had hoped that by confronting him directly, he might show some remorse or regret, but the reality was very different. I don't know what you're talking about, Roger said, crossing his arms arrogantly. All I've done is help Elaine. If I sold a few things, it was because she needed it. This house was falling apart when I got here. Brenda, always the most emotional of the three, stepped toward him, her eyes filled with fury. That's a lie. We know you've been stealing from her, selling her belongings and spending her money on your own whims. You have a history of this. Roger let out a nervous laugh, but there was a glimmer in his eyes that betrayed his growing unease. History? You don't know what you're talking about, this is all an exaggeration. Elaine asked me to help her, and that's what I've been doing. If you don't trust me, that's not my problem. Ashley, the most sensible of the three, tried to remain calm. She knew that letting anger take over would only make it harder to achieve what they wanted, but Roger's contemptuous tone was pushing her to her limit. Stop lying, she said, her voice firm but controlled. You can't deceive us anymore. We've spoken to people who know you, and we know what you've been doing with her money. Caroline, who had been silent until then, stepped forward. We're not here to argue, this isn't a game, Roger. We know you've been stealing from Elaine, and we're ready to take this to the very end. Roger shrugged, still clinging to his false narrative. You have no proof, you haven't seen anything. They are only making things up because it hurts them to see that Elaine can no longer take care of herself. I am the only one who has helped her. But Elaine's decline, her disorientation, and her sadness were not fabrications. It was evident that something dark had been happening in her life since Roger appeared, and the triplets knew they could not let any more time pass. Ashley exchanged a glance with her sisters. The decision was made without further words. She took out her mobile phone and, in front of Roger, began to dial the police. What are you doing? Roger asked, a mix of disbelief and fear in his voice. His confident demeanor began to waver as he saw that the triplets were not willing to back down. Doing what we should have done from the beginning, Caroline replied. We're calling the police, they will handle this. Roger's reaction was instantaneous. He stepped toward Ashley, his face contorted in a grimace of anger. You can't do that, there's no need to involve the police, you're just misunderstanding everything. Brenda, always protective, quickly stepped between Roger and her sister. Back off, she said firmly, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. Roger paused, assessing the situation. The atmosphere had shifted. The triplets were no longer scared girls or indecisive young women. They were ready to confront him, and they knew it. With a frustrated grunt, Roger stepped back, raising his hands. Fine, call them. I have nothing to hide, he said, though his voice betrayed his nervousness. Within minutes, the sound of police sirens broke the neighborhood silence. The triplets watched as the officers arrived, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. They had come this far, and now all that was left was to wait for justice to take its course. When the police entered the house, Ashley briefly explained the situation. Elaine, sitting in a corner of the living room, appeared disoriented, still trying to process everything happening around her. The officers listened attentively as the triplets recounted what they had discovered, providing the information they had collected about Roger's background and the evidence that he had been selling Elaine's belongings. "We want you to check everything," Ashley said. "There are documents, bank transactions, everything points to Roger exploiting Elaine since he got here." Roger, who had maintained his defiant stance until then, began to sweat as the officers searched the house. Soon, they found recent sales receipts, documents showing that he had been managing Elaine's bank accounts without her permission, and evidence that he had sold valuable items, many of which were gifts from the Harrisons, using the money for his own purposes. The silence that followed the discovery was deafening. Roger tried to defend himself once more, but his words sounded hollow, and his face reflected the fear that was now consuming him. "Elaine gave me permission to do all of that," he insisted. "She couldn't handle things on her own, I was just helping her." But the officers were no longer listening, the evidence was clear, and within minutes, Roger was handcuffed and taken to the police car. As he was let out of the house, the triplets watched in silence. There was no satisfaction on their faces, only a deep weariness. They knew that even though Roger was out of Elaine's life, the damage had already been done, and her emotional recovery would be a long process. When the house finally fell silent, Elaine, tears filling her eyes, looked at the triplets. Her voice trembled as she spoke, as if the words were too difficult to muster. "I'm so sorry, I didn't want things to come to this. I trusted him, and I didn't see what he was doing." Brenda, unable to contain her emotions any longer, stepped forward and hugged Elaine tightly. "It wasn't your fault, Elaine, the important thing is that you're safe now, and you don't have to go through this alone." Ashley and Caroline joined the embrace, surrounding her with the same love and protection that Elaine had given them throughout their lives. They felt Elaine's pain, but they also felt hope that together they could help her rebuild her life. "We've got you always," Caroline whispered. "You won't be alone again." Elaine, with tears streaming down her face, finally allowed that unconditional love to envelop her, knowing that even though her path had been difficult, she still had those three young women who loved her as if she were their own mother. After the emotional storm, Roger's arrest, and the revelation of betrayal, the triplets knew they could not let Elaine return to her solitary and deteriorating life. Elaine had been more than a nanny to them. She was the woman who had protected, loved, and cared for them during their most vulnerable moments. Now it was their turn to take care of her. The weeks following Roger's arrest were a mix of relief and sadness. Elaine, although freed from her cousin's destructive influence, remained a shadow of the vibrant woman the triplets remembered. The pain of betrayal and years of emotional war had left deep scars. The girls, along with their parents, the Harrisons, knew that only a complete change could help Elaine heal. One night, sitting in the living room of their home, the triplets discussed Elaine's future with their parents. Sarah and John Harrison, visibly moved by everything that had happened, were determined to do something meaningful for her. Elaine had